Hi everyone, it's me, Sue Zimmer with Human Anatomy and Physiology 1. It's spring 2020. So this video will cover the mandible and the maxilla. I recommend that you have the bones in front of you, or you at least have your textbook out so you can compare and contrast what we're doing here. So the mandible, here's the mandible. It's the lower part of your jaw. I recommend also, if you have the bones in your hands, it's easier to me if you know how it is in you. So I always hold it how it is in me. And then when I'm in my exams, if I don't have the mandible in front of me, I can know where it is on me, and I'm the model that I can draw logical conclusions to on the written exam. So it's just good practice to do that. So with the mandible, we'll start with the body. The body of the mandible is basically just the chin. That's the body, right along. So the body is the chin. Body. Next up, you have the rami. So I'm just going to take this and turn it. This right here, this portion, is the rami, and you have two of those. So you have one on each side. The textbook usually calls it the ramus of the mandible, meaning two of them. But if we're just talking about the one, we're just going to say it's the rami. So usually Helen just wants you to write rami because she's just going to label it once. She's not going to label it on both sides. So it's just going to be the rami right here. Next up, you have the mandibular condyle, which is this posterior portion here. Let me turn it so you can see it. So this is the mandibular condyle. The textbook calls it the mandibular process, but usually Helen will accept either name, either the name that she put on her lab handout or the name that's in the book. So I always call it the mandibular condyle because that's what I've always called it. So that's the mandibular condyle, it's the posterior. So on you, it's the posterior part here. So here's the front, turn it to the side. That's the mandibular condyle. And then anterior, on the anterior side, you have the coronoid process, which is right here. So I'm aware that's hard to see on the video. So I'm going to turn my bone sideways. And I'm pointing to this one in the front. That's the coronoid process. So the posterior, this sharp posterior part is the coronoid process. So on you, it's more to the front. So the mandibular condyle is posterior and the coronoid process is anterior. Practice that a lot. That's easy to get mixed up. And then you have the angle. So here's the front of my mandible. I'm going to turn it in a minute so you can see it better. But the angle is just like this little dip that comes off the rami. So I'm going to turn it sideways, bring it up close. That's the angle. So remember, here was the body. Here's the rami. Here's the angle, right here. So on me, it's kind of in here. That's the angle right here. So you have the angle on both sides. Here's the angle. You see that dip? Angle. Next up, you have the mental foramina. So the mental foramina, looking at the front of the jaw from your angle, are just these little holes. So turn it sideways. There's one mental foramina. There's one mental foramina. See, I'll put this in it. That's the mental foramina. Right here. One on each side. Then you're going to have the mandibular foramen. So the mandibular foramen, it's like inside the jaw. So I'm going to have to turn it around so you can see it. So here's the front. And turn it around. And then, so this right here is the mandibular foramen. I'll put my pipe cleaner inside it. You have one on each side. So that is the mandibular foramen right there. And then on the other side, you have it here without a pipe cleaner in it. That's your mandibular foramen. So it's on this, like the internal part. If I'm holding it like it is in me, it's like on the interior part. Then you have the alveolar margin. That's just where the teeth sit. So this is the alveolar margin. It's where your teeth sit. One other thing that I do want to note for you before we move on to the maxilla is that on the mandible, we have a feature that sounds really similar to a few other features on other bones, so make sure you mark it in your head because it's really easy to mix them up and you will lose the points if you do that. So I told you earlier that we have a coronoid process on the jaw, which is back here on the mandible. That's the coronoid process. Later on, when we get to the humerus, there's the coronoid fossa. So right here, you have the coronoid process, and then on your humerus, you have a coronoid fossa. So it sounds exactly the same, just one's a process and one's a fossa. But then to complicate matters even further, on your scapula, you have a coracoid process on your scapula. So that's coracoid, and that's on your scapula, whereas the coronoid is on your jaw and the coronoid is on your humerus. So you need to make sure that you don't mix those up. So some people like to sort of pretend that you can almost touch your jaw to the humerus a little bit. So it's kind of like you can touch your coronoids together, but the coracoid on the scapula, you kind of can't. So that's one way to think about it, but just mark that in your head as best you can. The humerus has a coronoid and the mandible has a coronoid, but the scapula has a coracoid. So practice that a lot. So next up for the jaw, we're going to go to the maxilla. So we're going to have to get the skull out again. Here it is. Good news is there's not much on there, so it's pretty easy. So the maxilla is the top part of your jaw, so here. So the mandible is the lower part that you can move, and the maxilla is the top part that you can't move that's attached to your skull. So the maxilla. On the maxilla, we have an alveolar margin. So you can probably guess what an alveolar margin is. It's where the teeth sit. So you have the alveolar margin on the mandible and the maxilla. It's where the teeth sit. So that's your alveolar margin right here. Then you have the palatine process. So be careful with this because the palatine process is a structure that's on the maxilla, but there's a palatine bone, which is its own bone, and they're right next to each other, so it's really easy to get them mixed up. If you watch the language that Helen puts on the test, that can be a little hint for you, because sometimes she'll say, name this bone, and if she says name this bone, and it's in this region we're about to talk about, she probably means the palatine bone, but if it says name this structure, she probably means the palatine process because that's a structure on the maxilla. So watch the language. Okay, so here we are, maxilla up close. I'm going to flip it up. Hopefully you can see the features on the video here. So the palatine process is this anterior portion. On our one here in the Student Success Commons, there's a screw. You can probably see that really well. What you probably can't see very well on the video is that there's like a line here. And after that line, the inferior portion is the palatine bone. So be really careful with that. The anterior portion is the palatine process of the maxilla, and the inferior portion, the posterior portion is the palatine bone, and that's right here. So look for that little line and watch the language that Helen uses. Bone is palatine bone, structure, and it's up here, is palatine process. Luckily on the maxilla, there's only one other feature, which is the infraorbital foramen. Bring it up close. Where do you think the infraorbital foramen is? Right here. So infra for below, orbital for eye, foramen for hole. So below eye hole is what it is in my head. So that right there is the infraorbital foramen. Of course, you have them on both sides. Right there. One there and one there. And that covers everything on the mandible and the maxilla. If you have any questions, feel free to drop into the Student Success Commons or send us an email, and I'll see what I can do. All right, see you next time.